Okay, welcome back to Mudwalkers. My name is Chris. Today we're talking about 1 Timothy chapter 2, as you could probably tell from the title. Over the last few years here on Mudwalkers, I have seen a lot of arguments around 1 Timothy chapter 2. Some arguments against my own view of the passage. One of the interesting ones that has come up recently is Paul's solution to the ostentation of these wealthy Greek women in Ephesus is not for these women to go around with no clothes on at all. The solution is still clothing. So let's talk about that. The first problem with this is that clothing doesn't necessarily mean not nudity. I know that sounds weird. We'll get into that in our next video. But suffice to say that there are lots of fabrics and even sitting or standing or walking positions that could just completely have a woman fully dressed and yet not concealing the parts of the body that textiles want covered. It just doesn't get you there. Of course, there's also the problem that Paul's contrast isn't concealment versus coverage, isn't exposure versus coverage. His contrast is between ostentation versus humility, familial humility. That also doesn't get you concealment. This episode of Mudwalkers has been brought to you by Patreon. These guys are my patrons. They're making the channel happen. They're keeping my work sustainable. So guys, thank you for what you're doing over on Patreon. On Patreon, everyone on Patreon gets early access to my mainline content videos like this one. Of course, if you're paid, there's a free option on Patreon. Nobody gets access to content for free. But depending on your level of support, people also get access to our monthly Zoom call, which is a great time for me and the patrons to just hang out and swap ideas and share stories and just in general hang out and have fun. You also get access, depending on your level of support, to my Patreon exclusive content. Things like cooking videos, travel vlogs, naturist resort tours, behind the scenes movie content, because I'm going to be in several nudist movies this year. I also have a website now, nakedmeanshuman.com. Over there you can sign up for my newsletter, and we'll be having more content coming on the website very soon, hopefully. I'm working on it. I'm not much of a website person. I'm much more of a stick and knife in the woods kind of person. But we're working on the website. It'll have more content coming up here very soon. Patreon is awesome. I could not be doing the things that I'm doing right now without Patreon. So thank you guys. If you want to support what I do, please consider signing up for like a month or two. Every little bit counts and it makes my world go round. Thanks so much. Let's get back into the video. Okay, for our next point, a regulation is not the same thing as a mandate. But what does that mean? It's like this, right? The Torah tells Israelites that instead of beating their slaves, they should treat their slaves well. Okay? You could just easily come into this situation and say, see, Chris, God's solution to cruel slavery isn't no slavery, it's still slavery. That's still the solution here. The difference is that we're talking about a regulation versus a mandate. The Torah isn't trying to tell us whether or not to have slaves. That's not the point of the slavery laws in the Old Testament. No one was required to own slaves because there were rules about slaves and their usage in the Torah. So when Paul is talking about clothing in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and he says, instead of X kind of clothing, wear Y kind of clothing, or instead of A clothing, wear B clothing, it's a regulation of the thing and not a mandate thereof. Paul doesn't say all people must wear clothes at all times in all social settings except for these ones, or else. He says, ladies, gathering for worship, stop wearing all the gold stuff and wear something humble and normal instead. That's his contrast. His contrast isn't concealment versus exposure. His contrast is ostentation versus humility. Paul doesn't say, never ever allow to be seen by anyone of the opposite sex except your spouse, except for medical or hygienic interventions. Paul doesn't say that. In fact, no one in the Bible says that, ever. That's never made a rule anywhere in the Bible. What he does say is, ladies, stop with all the gold and pearls and braided hair and expensive clothing, and instead, well, I'm getting ahead of myself there, but instead you should wear something more humble. Another point to consider here is that Paul's words don't apply to men at all. At least, he doesn't mention men directly. It's very interesting that Paul doesn't even mention men in his discussion of clothing here. So if we want to make a universal claim about clothing and humans, we're going to need a completely separate passage for that, because this passage only mentions women's clothing. We have another point here, which is of interest to me, and that is the long wait problem. To be fair, this point is less of a proof that the textile interpretation is wrong and more of a reason to just regard that interpretation with suspicion. But I think it needs to be said though. If the textile view on clothing is true, then clothing is not only a fundamental part of everyday human life, foundational, like it's moment to moment, like almost every second of your life, you're going to be wearing clothing on the textile view. So it's very basic and fundamental to the human experience. But more than that, on the textile view, it is absolutely morally vital. It's crucial that we wear clothes as opposed to not wearing clothes. It's of the utmost importance if it is true. If it is that vital, then the question needs to be asked, why did God wait across the long ages of human history until the 1st century AD, where he happens to mention in passing, in one sentence, in one epistle, out of the entire New Testament, that women have to wear clothes? Just mentions it one time and it never comes up again. So if 1 Timothy 2:9 does mandate for women to wear clothing, it doesn't mention men's clothing, but even if 1 Timothy 2:9 does mandate clothing for women, why isn't this mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, where you would expect to find it? It's not there. It's not anywhere in Leviticus, not even in Leviticus chapter 18. It doesn't show up anywhere in Tanakh, the Old Testament. It doesn't show up in the Gospels. It just shows up in this one sentence in one epistle in the New Testament. That should give us pause. One of the main reasons why I'm suspicious of the long wait problem is it paints God as either absent-minded or cruel. Hear me out. Unless I've missed some third or fourth option or options, it seems to me these are the only two options left to us if the textile interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:9 is correct. Now, to be clear, this isn't a claim made by textiles. I'm claiming this is an entailment of their position. It seems like it either paints God as absent-minded or cruel. So let's say that we say, oh, well, the reason God took so long is because he just forgot to mention it. It slipped his mind for a few millennia. While he watched people struggle with lust and everything, and there were naked people all over the Old Testament. No, he just never occurred to him to bring it up. Obviously, no one wants that option. No one wants to say that God is absent-minded. Not even open theists would say that. So that leaves us with the other option, which is that God is cruel. Now, what do I mean by cruelty here? I mean that if God didn't forget to mention it, then that means that he deliberately omitted it. And if the textile view is true, then this is, like I said, absolutely vital moral information. So he just deliberately withheld it for several thousand years. What, because he just wanted us to suffer that much longer? What would be the point of him making us wait for this information when he could have just told it to Adam and Eve immediately and cleared all this up and protected us for all that time? No, instead he waits all these long ages and then happens to mention it in one sentence and never says it again.
I do not believe it. I will not.
Christians do disagree on the age of the earth, but let's be gracious to the textile position and make God look as good as we can. Because if we take, say, theistic evolution, which would take the contemporary popular ages of the earth and the universe as billions of years, and human history as hominid history is a couple million years, modern human history hundreds of thousands of years. let's not go there, because that would make God look even worse. Let's go with young earth creationism, because that would be the fairest way to paint the textile view here in terms of their view of God. Because that would mean that God only omitted this information for about 4,000 years from creation to the time of Christ, if we take young earth creationism in its most extreme form, which is, the earth is 6,000 years old. So that would mean that God withheld this information for only about 4,000 years. Here's the thing. Again, you still have God either forgetting or deliberately omitting vital moral information to give humans for 4,000 years. For context, the United States is only about 250 years old. That's 1/4 of 1,000 years. We're talking about a span of time that's 1/16 the amount of time as God apparently forgot to mention the whole modesty thing. Or as long as he deliberately withheld it to make sure that we would suffer longer in the throes of lust. Do you see the problem here? If the textile interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:9 is true, it means that God omitted this from most of human history and never said it again. Do you see the problem?
I missed the part where that's my problem.
So I'm sorry if I don't take the textile interpretation. But with all these problems presented from the grammar of the passage and the cultures involved in the passage and the information that we have historically about why Greco-Roman women dressed this way in the first place, which was to accrue inappropriate social power to themselves, see this video up here for a fuller discussion of that issue, of the social power issue. With all this information in mind and these entailments that I mentioned, I just can't take the textile view on this passage. I do not see how you can get from, ladies, stop wearing all the ostentatious rich stuff and dress yourself humbly instead, how you get from that to make sure nobody sees these specific anatomical features, like making it about sight, about the body. In the passage, it's not about the body or seeing the body. It's about wealth. It's about the things that you are wearing on the body that make you look like a wealthy, powerful person. Paul is dealing with conflict in the entire context leading up to this verse. But then suddenly he's talking about sex for some reason. No, he's still talking about power and conflict in Christian Ephesus. His thought is flowing perfectly on this interpretation. It's not, my interpretation isn't even the naturist interpretation, okay? Naturists are not alone in taking this interpretation, as you'll see in the video I linked a moment ago. This is just how the world worked at the time. And then when you start getting into trying to define clothing in this culture versus that culture versus the other culture, you start figuring out that some cultures actually wore transparent clothing, or some cultures wore clothing that doesn't cover at all the parts that we as, well, not we, that modern Americans would want to cover. That's one of the most interesting parts of studying this issue, is that a lot of modern American Christians seem to think that covering the female breast and the genitals and the buttocks and the anus is just like instinctive to the human soul or something. If you look at the issue anthropologically about clothing and the lack thereof across human history and across various continents and things, you'll find that clothing has been a very on-again, off-again thing for humans throughout our history. Okay, if you're only looking at developed nations and developing nations, modern cultures with contact with Europe, then yeah, you're going to see a lot of cultures covering the same thing, because England and Portugal and Spain and France imposed, and the Netherlands, I guess, imposed their European standards of dress on basically the entire world. But when you look back before that, you'll find that there was an awful lot of people and cultures running around with nothing on that we would call clothing, even though in their culture it would have been considered clothing. We'll get into that in the next video.
Stay tuned.
But my dear textile, I know this question might seem rude, so please hear me. I intend this question in the deepest love and compassion. And I hope that you will hear the question in the heart that I'm offering it. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to ostracize or to make fun. I really genuinely want you to ponder this question. Is it really the passage or is it your paradigm? If you disagree with me on this passage, do you disagree with me because of the grammar in the passage and the culture into which it was written? Or do you disagree with me because it would shatter your modesty paradigm? I know that modesty is very important to people. It doesn't make it true. Atheism and Islam and witchcraft are important to people, but none of those things are true. Okay, so I want you to ponder this and understand, if we give up the conventional view of modesty, that doesn't mean that everyone just starts running around with no pants on. Of course, we should still love one another and try to dress for the context and the situation to love the people around us. Of course we should. That doesn't mean that we get that from 1 Timothy 2. That means we get that from love your neighbor as yourself. So I want you to ponder that this week. Is it the passage or the paradigm? I hope the video has been thought-provoking and entertaining. I will see you in the next one.